Sophie sat with her friends, Clara, Lila, and Sarah, at their usual meeting spot, discussing a topic that was far from ordinary. Clara, always the voice of reason, leaned in and said, "You know how men are, right? They'll think about all the benefits they'll get out of any proposal. But do you really think David will go for it?" Sophie hesitated. "I'm not saying I want him to sleep with other women," she explained. "He's 40 now. He's not out there chasing younger girls. He'll stay home with the kids while I get the freedom to explore. It'll work out." Lila chimed in. "Exactly. He's busy with work and the kids. You'll have your fun, and he'll never suspect anything." The more they discussed, the more Sophie started to believe it might work. Married to David for over 18 years, with 2 kids and a stable life, she had everything except excitement. As she neared 40, she began to feel bored. David was still a loving husband, but the thrill was gone. Clara had suggested an open marriage, and now it seemed like the only way to spice things up. "I'll talk to him tonight," Sophie said, determination in her voice. "I'll tell him after dinner." Claire's eyes sparkled. "He'll be grateful. Trust me, he won't be able to resist." That night, after dinner with their teenage children, Sophie decided to bring it up. She had no idea how David would react, but the idea of having lovers was far too tempting to ignore. But would he agree? Would he understand? The next evening, after the usual family dinner, Sophie gathered her thoughts. The table was cleared, the kids were on their phones, and David was reading through some work emails. Sophie felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. She had never discussed anything like this with David before, and the weight of her decision was heavy on her mind. "Sophie, you okay?" David asked, noticing the tension in her demeanor. He wasn't one to pry, but he could tell something was off. Sophie smiled weakly, trying to calm her racing thoughts. "Yeah, just tired," Sophie replied, brushing her hair back. The kids were distracted, which gave her some space to prepare for what she was about to say. Taking a deep breath, she stood up and motioned for David to follow her to the living room. The kids knew better than to interrupt their parents when they had private conversations, so they didn't ask any questions. As Sophie and David walked into the other room, she couldn't help but feel a mix of guilt and anticipation. "I need to talk to you about something," Sophie began. David looked at her curiously. He put his phone down and sat across from her, silently waiting for her to continue. Sophie hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. "I've been thinking. I feel like our relationship has become a bit routine. I love you, I do, but I'm craving something more, something exciting." David furrowed his brow, unsure of where this was headed. "What do you mean? We're doing fine. We've got a family, a home, everything we need. What more could you want?" Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but now that it was happening, it felt surreal. "I want an open marriage, David. I want us to be able to date other people. I'm not saying I don't love you, but I need to explore other experiences." The silence that followed felt suffocating. David's face immediately shifted. His body tensed and his eyes narrowed. Sophie felt like she had just dropped a bombshell, and the look on David's face confirmed her worst fears. This was not going to be easy. "No," David said, his voice steady but laced with anger. That's not something I ever agreed to. We made vows to each other. This is not what I signed up for. Sophie's stomach twisted. She knew he'd be upset, but hearing his reaction stung more than she had imagined. David, I just need more than this, more than what we've had. I need this for me. David's fists clenched as he stood up, pacing the room. You're asking me to be okay with you being with other people? To just accept it? Sophie didn't know what to say. The guilt was overwhelming, but at the same time, the idea of having the freedom to be with other people felt liberating. It's not about you being enough for me, David, she said softly. It's about my own needs. I've been feeling so stagnant. I just want to feel alive again. David stopped pacing and looked at her, his face unreadable. This is selfish, Sophie. You're asking for something that will change everything. I'm not okay with this. Sophie felt tears well up in her eyes. She had hoped David would understand, but instead, it felt like she had torn apart everything they had built together. I don't want to hurt you, she whispered. David turned away, walking towards the back door. I need some space, he said, his voice tight. I can't deal with this. Right now. Sophie stood in the middle of the room, her heart breaking. She had expected resistance, but this felt like a betrayal in itself. As David left the room, she knew the consequences of her request would be far-reaching. She could already see the damage she had caused. The next morning, Sophie woke up to an eerily quiet house. As she reached out to David's side of the bed, she was met with cold sheets, his side untouched. A wave of guilt washed over her. She hadn't expected him to be so distant, but the reality of her request hit her hard. She felt the weight of the silence between them. She took a quick shower, trying to shake off the anxiety that had settled in her chest, but it lingered, thick and suffocating. When she walked downstairs, the kids were already at the breakfast table, talking animatedly about their day. Sophie noticed a noticeable absence. David wasn't there. "Where's Dad?" she asked, her voice sounding a little more strained than usual. "He left early for work," their daughter, Ella, replied casually, not looking up from her phone. "He said he might be home late." For the first time in their marriage, David had left without even saying goodbye. Sophie felt a pang in her heart. It wasn't just the absence of words, but the emptiness that lingered in their home. At work, Sophie tried to focus, but the image of David storming off the night before kept playing in her mind. She texted him, keeping it light. "I love you, David. Let's talk when you get home." But as the day dragged on, there was no response. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, hoping it was him. But it never was. By the time evening came, Sophie had started to accept that things had changed. When she got home, David's car wasn't parked in the driveway. A feeling of dread washed over her as she thought about where he might be. Was he at a bar, trying to numb the pain? When he eventually returned, it was clear things had shifted. There was no warm greeting, no kiss on the cheek, just a brief, emotionless nod. The kids didn't seem to notice the tension between them, and the evening went by without incident. After dinner, David asked the kids to go to their rooms, signaling that he wanted to talk to Sophie. He didn't offer her a drink like usual, and Sophie could sense the coldness in his eyes. When they sat down, Sophie's heart raced in anticipation of what was coming next. "I did some research today," David said, his voice low and heavy with restraint. And I know that if I say no to you, you'll just go ahead and cheat on me anyway. Either way, I lose. So fine, he continued, almost reluctantly. You win, but we need rules. Sophie felt a small sense of relief mixed with guilt, but the tension was still palpable. She nodded, trying to control her emotions. No men in our house, David added firmly, and no physical affection for anyone you date. I don't want to know about it. And I'll stay here with the kids. Sophie felt her stomach churn. It wasn't the ideal outcome, but it was still a victory of sorts. She had gotten what she wanted, at least for now. David's anger had softened, but in its place was something darker. His words were filled with contempt. From now on, I'm not responsible for your emotional needs. You wanted this, so you deal with it. Sophie had been so focused on the idea of dating other people, she hadn't truly processed the emotional toll it was taking on David and on their relationship. As he stood up to leave the room, she realized that what she had asked for might destroy everything she had worked for. The following days were a blur of cold silence and tension. Sophie's attempt to reach out to David through messages and casual conversations were met with short, emotionless responses. It was like the man she had known for years was slowly slipping away, and she had no idea how to stop it. On Monday morning, Sophie woke up to find David already gone. There was no note, no goodbye kiss, just the quiet emptiness of the house. She had expected him to be upset, but this was different. He had withdrawn completely, emotionally and physically. His side of the bed remained untouched, a stark reminder of the distance growing between them. At breakfast, their daughter, Ella, asked casually, "Where's Dad?" Sophie tried to keep her voice steady. "He's working early this morning." The kids didn't seem to notice the change, but Sophie could feel it in her bones. The walls between her and David were growing higher with every passing moment. She tried calling him during the day, but each call went unanswered. The text messages she sent remained unread. She was left with nothing but the haunting feeling that she had broken something she couldn't fix. By the time evening came, she couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. When David came home, he didn't even look at her. His focus was entirely on the kids, and once again, the household felt like a cold, impersonal space. Sophie sat at the dinner table, watching him interact with their children as if she were complete stranger. After dinner, David asked the kids to go to their rooms. But this time, Sophie felt a knot tighten in her chest. She wasn't ready for what he had to say, but she knew it was coming. Once the house was quiet, David turned to Sophie. His face was hard, and his eyes were filled with anger that he hadn't let out yet. "Do you really think this is easy for me?" he asked, his voice barely containing his fury. "You think this is what I signed up for?" Sophie wanted to explain herself, to make him understand that she wasn't trying to hurt him, but the words got stuck in her throat. She had opened the door to this mess, and now there was no easy way out. David continued, his voice growing more intense with each word. "I don't know who you are anymore, Sophie. You're not the woman I married. You've changed, and I don't know if I can even look at you the same way." Sophie felt her heart break in that moment. She had wanted freedom, excitement, and new experiences, but she had never imagined it would come at the cost of everything she valued. David's words stung more than she expected. She had expected anger, but this was something else. This was the realization that she had broken him. "I never wanted this, David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you." But David didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, leaving the room without another word. Sophie sat there, numb. She had done what she thought was best for herself, but the truth was, she didn't know what to do now. The open marriage was supposed to make things better, but it had only made everything worse. She was losing David, and worse, she was losing herself in the process. As the days passed, the emotional distance between them continued to grow. Sophie's attempts to repair the damage were futile. David barely spoke to her. When he did, it was to remind her of the rules they had set. Rules she knew in her heart were only a temporary fix. She had pushed him too far. There was no going back from this. The days that followed were filled with tension and avoidance. Sophie tried to go about her daily routine, but the weight of her decisions pressed heavily on her shoulders. David barely acknowledged her. When they passed each other in the hallway or at the dinner table, there was no warmth, no familiar smiles. The space between them had become insurmountable. Sophie would try small attempts to reach out, a touch on his arm, a kind word, but David would pull away, his body language shouting louder than any words could. It was clear that he had emotionally detached himself from her. The man who used to be affectionate and loving was now a stranger, and it was Sophie's fault. She couldn't escape the guilt that haunted her every waking moment. The children, too, noticed the change, though they didn't quite understand it. Their behavior toward Sophie was a mixture of confusion and distance. They had always seen their parents as a united front, but now the cracks were too obvious to ignore. Ella, their teenage daughter, no longer sought Sophie's advice or comfort. Instead, she kept to herself. Her mind focused on her friends and schoolwork. Their son, Luke, was still affectionate, but even he seemed to sense that something was wrong. Sophie had hoped that things would settle down, that time would heal the wounds she had caused, but it was only getting worse. David's coldness was like a constant reminder of the betrayal that had taken place. She couldn't ignore it anymore. It was clear that David's emotional disconnect was deepening, and Sophie wasn't sure how to fix it. One evening, as Sophie sat in the living room, trying to focus on a book, she heard the familiar sound of David's voice. He was talking to the kids, telling them that he had made plans for the weekend. It wasn't unusual for David to plan things with the kids, but the tone in his voice was different. It wasn't the casual, warm voice of a father. It was distant, detached. Sophie tried to ignore it, but a wave of insecurity washed over her. He was moving on, and she could feel it. He wasn't emotionally available for her anymore, and now he was starting to create a life without her, even in small ways. Sophie's heart sank. She hadn't expected David to change so quickly, but now it was undeniable. He was no longer her husband in the way he used to be. Later that night, Sophie waited for him to come home from work, hoping that they could talk, maybe find a way to start repairing what had been broken. But when David walked through the door, his eyes didn't meet hers. He was focused on the kids, asking about their day. Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. What could she say that would change anything? Instead, She went to the kitchen to prepare dinner, her movements mechanical. She could hear David's voice from the living room, and it hurt to know that the family dynamic was changing, and she wasn't part of it anymore. She had wanted freedom, but what she had gotten was isolation. After dinner, as the kids went to their rooms, Sophie sat at the table, waiting for David to say something, anything. But he didn't. He simply stood up, stretched, and told her he was going to bed early. Sophie stayed at the table, her mind racing. Was this the new normal? Was this what she had done to their marriage? The realization hit her hard. She had wanted excitement and freedom, but now she was left with nothing but loneliness. As the days passed, Sophie found herself living in a haze of guilt and confusion. She tried to convince herself that things would eventually get better, that time would heal the wounds she had caused. But the reality of the situation was impossible to ignore. Her marriage to David was slipping away, and the more she tried to hold on, the further he seemed to drift. At work, Sophie went through the motions, but her mind was consumed by thoughts of David. She missed him, the man she had married, the one who used to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But that person felt like a distant memory now, replaced by a man who couldn't even look her in the eye. The more Sophie thought about it, the more she realized the depth of the damage she had done. She had broken their vows, and now there was no easy way to fix it. One evening, after a particularly cold dinner where David barely spoke to her, Sophie sat down on the couch feeling completely defeated. The kids had gone to their rooms and the house was eerily quiet. Sophie picked up her phone, intending to reach out to Janet for advice. But before she could dial, the sound of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Startled, Sophie got up and walked to the door. To her surprise, it was David. He stood there, his face neutral, but with a hint of something Sophie couldn't quite place. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She had resigned herself to the fact that their marriage was over, but now here he was, standing in front of her wanting to talk. "Of course," Sophie replied, trying to keep her voice steady. They moved to the living room, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was heavy, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, David broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice almost hesitant, "about what you said about the open marriage." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. "I don't know what I expected, Sophie," David continued. "Maybe I thought you were just having a phase, or that you'd change your mind. But now I see. I see that this is what you really want, and that's hard for me to accept." Sophie's heart ached as she listened to his words. She had known that David wasn't happy with the idea, but hearing him say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. She had wanted freedom, but in doing so, she had lost him. "I'm sorry, David," Sophie whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." David looked at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to understand. "You've hurt me, Sophie. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that I don't know who you are anymore. You've changed, and I don't know if I can love this version of you." Sophie felt her chest tighten as his words hit home. This wasn't just about an open marriage. It was about everything that had led up to it. The lies, the betrayal, The realization that their relationship was no longer what it once was. Sophie had asked for an open marriage thinking it would bring excitement, but instead, it had created an emotional chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. David took a deep breath and continued, his voice softer now. I've been thinking a lot about what we've become, and I don't want to live in this emptiness. I don't want to be married to someone who doesn't care about the vows we took. I don't want to be just roommates, Sophie. Sophie felt her heart break even more. She had hoped for reconciliation, but it was clear that David was already moving on in his mind. I still love you, David, Sophie said, her voice trembling. I never stopped loving you. But David shook his head. Love isn't enough, Sophie. Not anymore. For the first time, Sophie realized that she might have pushed him too far. She had wanted excitement, but now she was faced with the cold truth. David was done. The damage was done. Their marriage was fractured beyond repair, and there was no going back. David stood up to leave, his steps heavy. I think it's time we accept that we're just not meant to be anymore. I don't know what comes next, but I can't keep living like this. It's over. Sophie. Sophie sat there in stunned silence, the weight of his words crashing down on her. She had lost him, completely. The open marriage had been the catalyst for everything, but deep down, she knew it was her own actions that had led to this point. As David left the house, Sophie collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. She had gotten what she wanted, but now she didn't know how to live with the consequences. Sophie spent the next few days in a blur of confusion and sorrow. Her mind replayed the conversation with David over and over, each time feeling like a fresh wound. She had known that their marriage was strained, but hearing him finally say that it was over hit her harder than she expected. The house felt emptier than ever. The silence was deafening. Sophie wandered through the rooms, trying to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. But the weight of her actions was too much to ignore. She had wanted excitement, freedom, and the thrill of new experiences. But what she had gotten was loneliness and regret. David had made it clear that he was done. There was no room for reconciliation, no chance for the marriage to return to what it once was. The realization that she had pushed him too far settled in Sophie's heart. She had wanted to open the door to a new chapter in her life, but in doing so, she had shut the door on the only man she had ever truly loved. The kids, too, seemed to sense the shift. Ella was distant, refusing to talk much about anything, while Luke had become more withdrawn. Sophie tried to reach out, to comfort them, but the emotional weight of everything was too much for her to bear. She hadn't just hurt David, she had hurt her family. And now she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that felt irreparably broken. A few days after conversation with David, Sophie decided to take a walk to clear her head. She needed to make sense of everything. The park near their house was quiet, the cool breeze brushing her face as she walked aimlessly, lost in thought. As she sat on a bench, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Janet. "How are you holding up?" The text read. Sophie stared at the screen for a moment before typing a response. "I've lost everything. I thought I wanted something else, but now I realize I've lost what really mattered." Janet's response came quickly. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I know things are tough, but you have to face the consequences of your choices. You can't undo what's been done, but you can start healing. Sophie put her phone down and stared at the horizon. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. The open marriage? The affair with the idea of freedom. It had all seemed so enticing at first. But now, it was just a painful reminder of how her life had fallen apart. As she sat there, she heard a voice behind her. "Sophie?" She turned to see David standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to see him again so soon. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. David took a deep breath, looking down at the ground before meeting her gaze. "I wanted to talk. One last time." Sophie's heart raced, unsure of what to expect. Part of her wanted to reach out, to beg him to reconsider, but she knew that would only make things worse. "I've been thinking," David said, his voice soft but firm, "about everything. About us." Sophie waited, unsure of what he was going to say next. "I still care about you," he continued, his voice faltering slightly. "But I can't go back to what we were. I can't pretend like nothing happened. You changed things, Sophie, and I don't know if I can forgive you for that." Sophie swallowed hard, the tears threatening to spill. She wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that she still loved him, but the words stuck in her throat. "I never wanted this, David," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted something more." David nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. "I know, but sometimes wanting more means losing what you already have, and that's the price we pay." Sophie felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had made her choice, and now she was left to face the consequences. The life she had once known was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. David turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back at her one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Sophie, but I don't think it's here." With that, he walked away, leaving Sophie standing there, heartbroken and alone. The days following her conversation with David were some of the hardest of Sophie's life. She felt a deep sense of emptiness, a void that couldn't be filled by anything. The house, once bustling with the sounds of family, now felt like a cold, unfamiliar place. Sophie had tried to find solace in her friends, but even their well-meaning words couldn't erase the deep sorrow she felt. She tried to focus on work, but her mind was often elsewhere. She would catch herself staring blankly at her computer screen, thinking about the life she had once had with David, the life she had thrown away in pursuit of something fleeting. She had wanted excitement, but now she understood that true happiness didn't come from thrills. It came from love, commitment, and trust. Her relationship with the kids was strained as well. Ella, her teenage daughter, had become distant, refusing to talk about anything related to Sophie's personal life. Luke, on the other hand, seemed to want to avoid the conflict, retreating into his own world. Sophie tried to explain herself, tried to make them understand that she had made a mistake, but words felt hollow in the face of the damage she had caused. She knew she had broken their family, and it was a painful reality to accept. It wasn't long before Sophie made the decision to leave the house. It was clear that she couldn't stay there, not with all the memories and the constant reminder of what had been lost. She moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, hoping the change of scenery would help her start over. But starting over wasn't as simple as moving to a new place. The guilt still lingered, hanging over her like a dark cloud. Sophie spent her nights in silence, staring at the empty walls of her new home, wondering if she would ever feel whole again. She had sacrificed everything for the illusion of freedom, and now she was left with nothing but the pieces of a broken life. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Janet. "Are you okay?" The text read. Sophie hesitated before replying, unsure of how to answer. She hadn't spoken to Janet in a while, not since everything had fallen apart. But she knew she needed to be honest with herself and with her friend. "I'm not okay," Sophie replied. "I've lost everything. I thought I knew what I wanted, but now I just feel empty." Janet's response was quick. "Sophie, I know it's hard, but you can't keep blaming yourself. You made a choice, and now you have to deal with the consequences. But that doesn't mean you can't heal. It just takes time." Sophie stared at the message, the words sinking in. Time. That was the one thing she didn't feel she had. But maybe, just maybe, Janet was right. Healing would take time, and the first step was accepting the reality of her situation. She had made mistakes, but that didn't mean she couldn't move forward. It just meant she had to learn from them. As Sophie sat in her new apartment, surrounded by the unfamiliar silence, she finally allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had lost. She missed David, missed the family they had been, but she also knew that she couldn't change the past. All she could do was move forward, slowly and painfully, one step at a time. Weeks passed, and Sophie's life slowly began to take shape again, though it was far from the life she had imagined for herself. The loneliness of her apartment became her constant companion, but in some ways, it also offered a strange sense of peace. She had more time to think, to reflect on the choices she had made, and what her future might look like. She spent her days working, her evenings alone, and while she still missed the life she had with David, there was a quiet acceptance settling in her heart. One Saturday morning, after weeks of solitude, Sophie decided to take a walk. She felt the need to clear her head, to be outside. As she walked through the park near her new apartment, she noticed the vibrant colors of the fall leaves, the children laughing, the couples walking hand in hand. Life, it seemed, was still moving on for everyone else. It was there, in the midst of the park, that she ran into someone she hadn't expected to see. Tom. He was standing by a bench holding a coffee cup, looking as if he had been waiting for her. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't thought about him much in recent weeks, but here he was, standing in front of her, his smile both comforting and surprising. "Hi, Sophie," Tom said, his voice warm but with a hint of caution. "How have you been?" Sophie stood still for a moment, unsure of what to say. She hadn't expected to run into him, and yet, here he was, the man who had once offered her a temporary distraction from her crumbling marriage. "I've been okay," Sophie replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "A lot has happened." Tom nodded, his expression softening. "I can imagine. I heard about you and David. I'm sorry things turned out this way." Sophie managed a weak smile. "It's my fault. I wanted something different. But now I've lost everything that really mattered." Tom didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes reflecting a mix of understanding and sympathy. "You can't go back, Sophie. But you can start again. You don't have to figure it all out right now, but you need to let yourself heal. Sophie looked at him, feeling a sense of comfort in his words, even though she wasn't sure if she was ready to take them to heart. "I don't know if I'm ready to move on, Tom," she admitted. "I don't know if I can ever fix what I've done." "You don't have to fix everything right away," Tom replied gently. "It's about taking small steps. You've been through a lot, but you can still find a way forward." Sophie felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know if she could ever find a way back to the happiness she once had. But hearing Tom's words made her think that maybe there was hope. Maybe this wasn't the end, but just the beginning of something different. She didn't have to figure it all out in one moment. She just needed to keep moving forward, slowly, at her own pace. As they talked, Sophie realized that Tom wasn't asking for anything from her. He wasn't pushing her to make any decisions. He was just there, offering support without judgment. It felt comforting, but also overwhelming. Sophie had always been so sure of everything in her life, and now she wasn't sure of anything. But at least for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in her uncertainty. When the conversation turned to other things, work, the weather, plans for the coming week, Sophie began to feel a sense of relief. She wasn't talking about her past mistakes anymore. She wasn't obsessing over her failed marriage. She was just having a conversation, something she hadn't allowed herself to do in a long time. "Maybe we can do this again sometime?" Tom asked, his eyes softening as he watched Sophie. Sophie nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt a sense of possibility. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but she knew that for now, it was enough to take it one step at a time. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to heal, to rebuild her life, even if it was different from what she had once imagined. In the weeks that followed, Sophie continued to take small steps toward rebuilding her life. She started seeing Tom more often, not in a romantic sense, but as a friend, a person who didn't judge her for her past mistakes. He offered her the kind of support she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was something. It was a small piece of stability in a life that had once been turned upside down. Sophie also began to reconnect with her kids in a way she hadn't been able to since everything had fallen apart. Ella, her daughter, was still distant, but Sophie tried to give her the space she needed. She reached out more to Luke, and slowly they began to rebuild the bond they had lost during the chaos of the last few months. It wasn't perfect, but Sophie was trying. She also started therapy, something she had put off for far too long. It was there that she began to understand the deeper issues that had led to her decisions. The feelings of suffocation, the craving for excitement, and the fear that she was losing herself in her marriage. Through therapy, she started to understand her actions better, and more importantly, how to heal from them. Despite the progress, Sophie still couldn't shake the sense of regret. She missed David. She missed the family they once had. There were moments when she wished things had gone differently, when she could take it all back. But the reality was that she couldn't. She couldn't go back to what had been. One day, out of nowhere, Sophie received a message from David. It had been weeks since they had spoken. Sophie's heart raced as she read the simple text. I'm not sure where we go from here, but I think we should talk. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go. But she knew that avoiding this conversation wouldn't change anything. She had to face it. She had to face him, even if it was the hardest thing she'd done in a long time. The next day, they met at a coffee shop. The tension between them was palpable, but it was different this time. There was no anger, no shouting. There was just a quiet understanding that their relationship had changed forever. Sophie still cared deeply for David, but she knew that they couldn't go back to what they had. "I've been thinking a lot," David said, looking at Sophie across the table. "I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did, but I've realized that I can't keep holding on to the past either. We're not the same people we were when we first met." Sophie nodded, her throat tight. "I know. I've changed too." There was a long silence as they both sat there, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. It wasn't easy. There were no promises made, no declarations of love. But Sophie felt something shift in her heart. She wasn't sure what the future held, but, for the first time, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of her mistakes alone. "I don't know what happens next," David continued, "but I think we've both realized that we need to move forward. Maybe not together, but separately, in a way that's healthy for us and for the kids." Sophie smiled faintly. "I agree. I'm sorry, David. I wish things had been different." David reached out and squeezed her hand. "Me too. But I think we both know we have to find our own paths now." As they parted ways that day, Sophie felt a sense of closure, even if it was bittersweet. The weight of her past decisions wasn't something she could simply erase, but she had come to terms with the fact that it was part of her story now. She didn't need to be defined by her mistakes. Sophie knew that she still had a long way to go in terms of healing, but for the first time in months, she felt hopeful. There was a future for her, even if it looked nothing like what she had once imagined. And maybe, just maybe, she would find peace in the journey ahead.